Okay, we're continuing Pei Daled Halacha test. Last time we talked about the rules of Miyad HaMatzui. How do you decide if something is or is not a Miyad HaMatzui to decide whether you have to check that vegetable for bugs. As you mentioned, that didn't really comes from Hilchos Treifus. Okay, but it's not only in Hilchos Treifus and Hilchos Talan that those didn't apply. That's when you hear about it. But it really applies to any din. Anytime when you have a suffix, if it's Isser or not, you want to know, do I have to check for it, do I not have to check for it? Then the rule of Miyad HaMatzui comes into play. And today we're going to talk about two situations where that may or may not be true also. Two other situations. The first one actually is food related, not so much for us, and the second one is not. Okay, the first one is the din of Arlah and Eretz Yisrael. Okay, the din of Arlah is if you have fruits for the first 3 years, you're not allowed to eat them. In Chutz La'aretz, we come out and never think about that, because the din is Safek Arlah and Chutz La'aretz is mutter. If you have any possibility that it's mutter, so basically we don't have to think about it unless you have a tree growing in your backyard. You don't have to be Kashrus for Arlah, because it's always a Safek, and maybe it's Arlah, maybe it's not. So we say Safek Arlah and Chutz La'aretz is mutter, and you're off the hook. But if there's fruits from Eretz Yisrael, it actually came up just recently. There's a fruit called a sweetie fruit. Okay, the more formal name for it is Oro Blanco. It's a type of a mix between grapefruit and a pomelo, so that fruit comes from Eretz Yisrael. Well, the din Eretz Yisrael is Safek Arlah and Eretz Yisrael is Aser. Okay, so what should when a person walks into the fruit store in Eretz Yisrael? Of course, in Eretz Yisrael, fruit stores have a hechsher on them because of Trumas and Shemitah and Arlah. They want to make sure there's no Arlah in the fruit that you're getting. Okay, but if I would just walk over to a fruit stand and see oranges there, well, how do I know if they're Arlah or they're not Arlah? How am I supposed to know? Okay, so there are people who print charts that tell you what percentage of each variety of each fruit is Arlah or not Arlah. They just tell you what percentage. But at what percentage do I have to be machmir for? Okay, so there's basically 5 shittas about that. 1, 2, 3, 4 shittas.
You're talking about there's 10 oranges.
What percentage is on the market? Okay, if we have this type of...
you don't know whether it is or it isn't.
Right, I don't know. I pick up an orange, okay, and I say, here's a
worldwide market or that market?
In Eretz Yisrael. They're saying for Eretz Yisrael what there is. So how much of that fruit is Arlah? Okay, so there's basically...
How much of each individual fruit, or how much of the total fruit that you buy?
Of the fruit that's in the market, how much of it is...
Of that particular fruit.
Of red, delicious apples, what percent of red, delicious apples being sold in Eretz Yisrael are Arlah. So there's basically 4 shittas, 4.5 shittas, okay? And we're going to go through them quickly. That's not really what we're here for. One is, the Ravad says, that as long as it's about the bride, okay, as long as it's less than half of the fruit of that type of fruit is not Arlah, you're off the hook. You're allowed to buy it. Why? Because it's not a suffix. The Rav says that it's mutter. Now we know that we don't usually follow Rav. That's what we talked about. That you usually have to be Kashrus for Miyad HaMatzui. In that case, there are many sveikas. He has a whole pile of sveikas. I forgot how many he has. Many sveikas the Rav brings, and there are those who are samech on him that say that since there are many sveikas, therefore you could be samech on Rav. Okay, so as long as it's less than 50%, you're okay. Okay, Chaim Kanievsky brings that the din is, which is what we're talking about, is you should follow Miyad HaMatzui. If it's less than 10% are Arlah, then you don't have to be Kashrus for it. Each fruit I pick up, is this red delicious apple from Arlah or from not Arlah? I say if less than 10% of it, I don't have to be Kashrus for it. That's what he says. Another group of people, and this is what most people do, is what I'm about to say, is they say it has to be less than 0.5%. Where'd they come up with that number from? They say that since there are known farms that have Arlah fruit on them in Eretz Yisrael, so now the fruit that I have in front of me, it's not a statistic. Is that 10% of the fruit in the market are Arlah? If that we know that there are hundreds of cases of red delicious apples out there someplace that are Arlah, so it's a taruvas. It's a mixture of mutter and aser. Okay, it's not a statistic. When I pick up a lettuce, I don't know. It's not that there are bugs got lost in my field. Someone threw 10 bugs into the field and I don't know where they are. It's that I have vegetables that 10% of the time they get bugs in them. That's different than in this case where there are specific fields where we know that those fields have Arlah in them, or growers who are selling Arlah out in the field. So the market out there is a mixture of Arlah and not Arlah. the din for Arlah is it's not about the Bashishim, it's not even about the Baroy like many foods are. Many Isurim are about the Baroy, it's about the Masayim. It has to be about 200. So it has to be less than 0.5% in order to make the fruit mutter. So it doesn't depend on Mina Matzik. And the last Shita, the most Chomertic Shita, which I don't think most people follow, what the most Chomertic Shita is to say that there can't be even any Arlah. Okay? And that's more complicated than we can talk about, is because they say that's not a case of Roiv, it's a case of Kavua. Okay, and the rule is Kol Kavua K'mechza Mechza. Okay, it's a little too complicated for us, but Kol Kavua K'mechza Mechza, that since there are known farms that have Arlah of that kind of fruit, even if there's a tiny percent, then that's Kavua, and now any fruit on the market could just as easily come from here as from here, and it's too, I know, you gave this question, it's too complicated. I'm just telling you that there's such a Shita. There is such a Shita. Okay? When we found out that this sweetie fruit had 0.05%, I forgot what the number exactly was, according to the charts, that's a very tiny amount. Therefore, just about everybody holds that that's mutter, and that's why if you go to Costco and you buy your sweetie fruit there, you can buy them now, you have to be mafresh shumas amaises, because it comes right so, but you don't have to be choishes for them. Okay. What do you say? No, 0.5%, 0.5%
0.05
is
1/200.
No. 0.5 would be 1 at 200. 0.05 would be 1 at 2,000.
2,000, yeah.
Okay, so now let's move to our second thing. Okay, we'll spend a little more time on the second one. Okay, the second is another thing, which is, I buy something made out of wool. Okay, if there's linen mixed into it, then I'm not aware that's Shatnez. Okay, so when I buy coat, Yossi is wearing a wool coat. Okay, I go to buy a wool coat. Do I have to get a check? Do I not have to get a check for Shatnez? Do I have to be choishish that coat has Shatnez or doesn't have Shatnez in it? So, seemingly, the rule should be it should depend on me and on Matzi. If it's common that coats have Shatnez in them, then it should be choishish. Yeah, David's wearing a wool. I don't know if it's wool. Wool's okay. We'll pretend it's a wool sweater. So if it's wool, so you should do 10% of wool sweaters have Shatnez in them, then I have to check it. If less than 10%, then I shouldn't have to check. That's seemingly, according to what we say, Min HaTorah you would follow Roiv, Midrabanan you have to be Choshesh from Min HaMatzi. So seemingly the rule should be it should depend on Min HaMatzi. Okay, well, that's not what we do. Okay, that's not what we seem to be practicing. Basically, we do anything, just about, they tell us just check anything. I looked at I don't know if this is the most recent, but the official Shatnez guide. It actually comes from Baltimore, but it's through the Shatnez lab in Lakewood. The official from 2010, June 2010, has a whole list of every item that they could think of, starting from Army Navy surplus all the way down to yarn. Okay, they have nothing with a Z that they could check. I guess the zippers don't need to be checked. So they had everything from Army Navy surplus all the way down to yarn, and for everyone, it basically said the same thing. Okay, I'm really not doing justice to 10 pages of a thing, but basically it never said is, if it's got wool in it, you have to check it. Okay, basically that's what it said. Now, but that report differentiated in certain cases very, very specifically between whether you have a scarf that's one color or multicolored. Okay, I don't remember which one had to be checked. They would direct this one has to be checked or this one doesn't have to be checked, depending on in very fine detail. So was that made based on the rules of Mida Matzah? Is that what they did? Is that how you don't get the impression that that's what it is? The impression, the overall impression you have from reading it is, if it's got wool, you have to check it. So how did they come up with these numbers? And I'll ask the question from a different side. People, I hope you're not insulted, but people like myself, whom I guess buy cheaper clothing, almost never have Shatnez. I can't remember the last time that I found Shatnez in my clothes. So, okay, never found Shatnez. So does that mean, I can't remember the last time it happened, so did it maybe happen? I don't know, but, so does that mean that maybe people like me, the kind of clothes that I buy that don't tend to get Shatnez, maybe you don't have to check at all? Maybe he says, maybe there isn't how much that scars have Shatnez, but not my kind of scars. The suits that I buy, obviously, I don't deal in those kind of things, so maybe for me, my, scale of clothes that I buy is just not a million amounts. So am I off the hook? Do I not have to check my clothes for Shatnez?
And when you talk about, just to add a little insight into that, when you talk about inexpensive clothing, depends on the tekufa.
Okay.
Because this year, artificial material is cheap. If next year linen is cheap because there's a glut of linen on the market, that your jackets that you've never, ever had a problem are going to be full of linen.
Okay, very good. Shulchan Aruch actually talks about that, about when linen, the price of linen as it goes up and down, does that maybe affect how you have to check? Okay, that might be a point, but I have a long history. I don't have a great memory, but I can't remember it, and Yossi can't remember ever finding it. So that means through up and down, it's been pretty stable. That
that much of it up and down, what would cause that kind of an issue is a pretty drastic going up and down.
Okay.
If you have a clientele that's happy with what you're using, and there's a 10% drop, you're not going to change it. If there's a 50-60% drop, which doesn't happen too often, then you don't care what your clientele wants. You're gonna change it.
Got it. Okay. So I looked at a sefer called Sefer Hashatnez Halacha Ulamaisa. Okay. So that's what it's called. And it's called Halacha Ulamaisa because there's one section called Halacha and another section called Lamaisa. Very interesting. The sefer is split up. Anyhow, what? Someone from, I believe, Bnei Brak. I don't remember who it was. So a lot of the Marmar comments you're about to hear in this first section, before we get to the second section, is going to be from him. Okay, and based on things that I saw there, there's two possible ways to explain why we should be choshesh even though it's not a miyad hamotzi, specifically for Shabbos. One is, we saw last time, the Rashba gives two reasons as to why you only check for certain treifas. Remember, you check only for the lungs, you don't check the other treifas, all the rest of the body. One reason has to do with if it's motzui. And that's what we commonly talk about, that it depends if it's motzui or it's not motzui. But the Rashba had a second reason. The Rashba's other reason was that he says if it's easy to check something, he says you're going to cut the animal open anyhow. He says if you wouldn't look at the lungs to see if the animal's a treifa, it's as if you don't care about the isser. So it's sort of like you have to do it because or else it's like you're being callous about the isser of eating a treifa. So why aren't you looking at those lungs? It shows a bad attitude, and therefore you have to check the lungs. You don't have to check the vein, the tendons on the legs because no one's looking at there anyhow. But to like walk right past it and not even look, that's something wrong with that. And therefore, the same thing would potentially be for Shatnez. If it's really easy, it's just come on, you know your suit might have Shatnez in it, so why not have someone look at it? Your scarf, if it may have threads of linen, so honestly, you can't just go to Abe Sharp and just show it to him. Come on, you walk in here every day. You can't just show him and say, Abe, does this have Shatnez in it? So it's as if you don't care about the Isser, and that's the reason. So even in cases where the miyad hamotzi, it's not so common, but even if it's not common, you have to check it. If it's so you're passing right by it, you're not showing seriousness to the Isser if you don't get it checked. Ramosha says this. Ramosha says, the way I read it, of Ramosha is that you're not that you're mechuyev min hadin, but he says it's a chumrah to be particular and check it even though it's not matzui, but still, since it's so to speak so easy to do it and you're not doing it, that shows that it's that you're callous and you're not, and therefore you have to check it. That means even if it's not matzui, because of the other reason of the Rashba. Okay, and I mentioned to you last week also, there's a different truth for Ramosha, who says, for that reason, when you cut open chickens, the people in the slaughterhouse who cut open the chickens should be Yidden. He means as Yidden who know what treifas look like. Yidden because, or else, even though we don't check chicken lungs, we don't check them, but you should cut it open because if there be something out of the ordinary there, you would catch it if you notice that it would be a treifa. So it's as if you don't care if you don't check it.
So Rashi says
he doesn't. I don't believe. He says since it's efshel of this is his words. Since it's efshel of rurei machmarina levarer. The wording does not sound like you're mechuyev to. Even the way he differentiates it, because he says in his case that he's talking about, if someone who would lose money if they got it checked, someone who's selling suits, what if he would lose money by that? He's not mechuyev to. I mean, it's not saying that you're mechuyev to. He says machmarina, and it's a chumrah to do that. Okay, so that would be potentially a reason why we have to check it, but we don't have to just think then. Would that be true then for vegetables also? Would we say the same thing? Meaning, I'm not sure what you would do, but would you, if you have a carrot, would you say, you should look at the carrot first to make sure there are no bugs on it? I mean, should you look at your apple before you eat it to make sure there isn't a worm in it? It's not matzui, but it's easy to do it. So maybe that's what it means. I'm not sure. Okay. A second reason why you should maybe check things is, the Shef Shmaitza says that there are different types of rois. And as you can well imagine, the Sefer has a lot to say about that. And the Shmaitza says like this. He says, any roiv that depends on someone's decision, a human being's decision, that's a weaker type of a roiv. The roiv that we rely on is a roiv like by insects. Roiv vegetables, if a roiv of a certain vegetable don't have insects, the Torah says you can follow the roiv and you could eat that vegetable. That's only true by by an item where the roiv is dependent on a statistic, dependent on some fact of nature. Most times this is what happens. Or most times it's not what happens. As opposed to something that depends on a person, his case is, when people buy animals, do people buy animals because they want to use them to work or they want to use them to shech? So there might be a roiv in one direction, but the roiv is very much dependent on the person. It's someone's mind. You might tell me that most people buy it for this purpose, but I had a different thing in mind. He says that's a weaker type of a roiv, and that roiv is not as strong as it doesn't work in certain cases. So in that, therefore, when the manufacturer is sitting about to make your suit, it might be that roiv suits, roiv scarves, roiv shoulder pads don't have shatnez in them, but since it's dependent on someone's decision, there's some human being who's making that decision, should I use the linen or should I not use the linen? It's a weaker type of roiv, and since it's a weaker type of a roiv, therefore, even though it's not a miyad hamatzi, it's a weaker type of roiv.
Who's applying the Shmaitzer?
This is what the Shmaitzer says.
Who's applying the Shmaitzer to Shabbos?
This one particular, this sefer, is applying it to here. Now, I have to tell you something. I'm going to tell you. I'm not finished. I'm almost finished. That sefer brings that Rabbi Yashiv said that that's only true unless it's rare. Okay, and let me explain to you what I mean by that. When the Shmaitzer says that those kind of rois are not a good rois, he says, but that I'm saying I'm a little moving over from the Shmaitzer to Shimon says that that's only true when there isn't some strong logical argument for the roiv anyhow. So in our case, if it's really rare, in this case, Rabbi Yashiv said, if it's less than 1% of the people use linen in that type of clothing, so then, even though the roiv is weak, it's based on a person's decision, but since it happens so rarely, that in itself strengthens the so to speak, the roiv to say that there's no shatnez in this clothes. So what we're doing is we're saying is, if 90% of the people, if 90% of the time there's no shatnez in it, we say, listen, but a person is making the decision, so maybe he'll decide that he wants to put it into this clothing, or he'll run out, or whatever his reason will be, he'll use it. So then you would say, you have to be choshesh, even though it's very rare that it happens. But if only in less than 1% of the time, then we would say is, since it's such a rarity, therefore that in itself strengthens the roiv and makes it, now you have to carry on the roiv. Okay? What I'm trying to make, my point here is that if the Shmaitzer says it's not a good roiv, we lost our whole basis. The whole idea of miyad hamatzi is, midoraisa you follow the roiv, and midorabanan now you have to choshesh miyad hamatzi. If there's no roiv, then we have nothing to talk about. Okay, so what he's trying to say is that there's no roiv here in the first place. Okay? Well, the question on this sheet is, just before we wind it out, is the question on this sheet is going to be, the Shmaitzer is saying that he says it's a weak roiv, but he doesn't say it's not a roiv at all. He says it's a weak roiv, and therefore by Dine Mominus, you can't rely on that roiv. He's explaining why in Dine Mominus certain roivs do work and certain roivs don't work. But we're not talking about Dine Mominus. We're talking about Issa v'heter. Issa v'heter, even a week. That's what the Shmaitzer says. Shimon for sure says. But Issa v'heter, even that weak roiv is considered a good roiv. So it's not so clear that you can apply that to Shatnez, because Shatnez is Issa v'heter. So yes, it's a weak roiv because the roiv depends on someone's personal decision rather than on a piece of information or statistic, but weak roivs are also good for things, and l'chayre it should be good for Issa v'heter. Okay, so we could question that whether the Israel is not appropriate, but I think that there's a answer that the whole question is a mistake. Okay, well, I don't know a mistake, but the whole question there's potentially a third answer, a completely different answer. That it's a different style of answer. This is not from that sefer. That potentially would explain why it wasn't a question in the first place. And that is like this. There's a mission in Klayim, and the mission says, the first time the mission says, that if you have, he lists off a whole bunch of different types of clothing, and he says all these types of clothing have to be checked for shatnez before you wear them. He lists a whole bunch of clothing. Then Rabbi Yossi says that if that clothing comes from overseas, then you're not mechuyev to check it, because those overseas manufacturers, those overseas manufacturers don't use linen, and therefore you don't have to check them. On the Yerushalmi, on that Mishnah, the Yerushalmi in that Mishnah says, Rabbi Yossi, he said, if you buy it from overseas, you don't have to check it. That was true in his time. But nowadays, that linen is more common, then you are mechuyev to check it even from overseas. Okay, that's what the Yerushalmi says about Rabbi Yossi. Okay. That Yerushalmi is brought in the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, and they say if you buy, this is what they say. They don't bring the words of the Yerushalmi, but they say, because the Yerushalmi says that Rabbi Yossi's din is not true anymore, they say the following: if you buy clothes from a guy, meaning, let me back up. They're assuming if you buy it from a Yid, of course the Yid would make it with Shatnez. If you buy clothes from a guy, then you're mechuyev to check it. You have to carefully check it to make sure there's no Shatnez. The words they use is tzarich levatka yafa, to make sure that there's no linen inside of it. Okay? Now, how come they don't say, and nobody else afterwards says, it depends on how common it is? Where is everybody saying that it depends on Mina Matzah? Back to our original question. The Yerushalmi says, since they now have linen in overseas, they use it's common to have linen there, so therefore you mechuyev to check it. So why does Shulchan Aruch say check everything? Why do you check everything? Doesn't it depend on Mina Matzah? How come no one says it afterward? Where's everyone to say that it depends on Mina Matzah? So I think that this question, the Yerushalmi, is really answering the question. The Yerushalmi says, the reason why the Yerushalmi doesn't say this, listen to the words of the Yerushalmi. Aval achshav shahapishta mitzuya b'chol makom tzrichim b'dika. That's what the Yerushalmi says about Rabbi Yossi. I think what the Yerushalmi is trying to say is, when the Shmaitza said it's a weak roiv because it depends on a person whether he should check or he shouldn't check. So what we're looking for mid hamotzui is not if it's motzui that a scarf has shatnez in it. We're looking for motzui is linen motzui. In other words, the criteria for a treifa is most cows have this type of treifas? Do most lettuces have these kind of bugs? So much over there, you look at does the vegetable have it? Is the insect there? Over here, we don't look for motzui. Do scarves have it? That's not the right thing to look at because that depends on a person. It can go this way or that way. When we look at motzui, is linen motzui in the place? If linen is motzui in that place, then anything can have shatnez in it. Anything that has wool can have shatnez in it. So what the criteria is not motzui of belts and scarves and jackets. It's motzui is linen in the market is linen motzui. If linen is motzui, then you can check everything then. Everything that has wool in it. So if so, once we said our achshav shahapishta mitzuya, one pishta, we didn't say not like this. It's motzui in these kind of clothes. It's motzui. Shahapishta mitzuya in those places, which it is now all over the world. This pishta is around. Once this pishta is mitzuya, now you're mechuyev to check everything from those places. Anything that has wool, you're mechuyev to check from that place. So that means that basically you have to check everything except, like you said before, Rabbi Yasher said, if it's really rare that something happens, Rabbi Shachta said by tuna fish, even a meir who's choishes l'miuta, if it's less than 1%, it's a miuta de miuta, and you're not mechuyev to be choishes for that. So even this has a rule to it. If there's some special reason to believe, if they understand that people who make single-colored scarves instead of multicolored scarves don't put in linen, sometimes there's an overriding factor that says even though linen is motzui, in this kind of case you don't have to check. But the starting assumption is once pishon is mitzuya, you're automatically mechuyev to check. Again, there's going to be exceptions here and there for special cases. It's really rare to have it, and then you're going to get off the hook. But until you get to the point where it's with some special exception, when it's really rare, meaning less than 1%, that's Rabbi Yasher and Rabbi Shachta both saying the same number in different situations, but unless it's really rare, we're going to say since the pishton is, we're not going to care. The shatnez layer doesn't have to sit around and take statistics of how many wool ties have shatnez in them or how many linen ties have shatnez in them. They have to say once it has one and the other min is motzui, then already you're mechuyev to check it. Even because the motzui is not, we have to look at the right thing to decide if it's motzui, not at the piece guard.
Why should it depend on the
I think the reason is because of what the Shmaitza said. Since the decision to use wool linen is totally on a person, it's not the right thing to look at. You can't look at it, do people usually put it in or they don't put it into this type of clothing? Because
you said before, it's this.
So we do follow that roy, but I'm saying here we have two choices of how to make our roy over here. We can make a roy based on jackets, or we can make a roy based on the linen.
Why doesn't it make sense to do it based on jackets?
So I'm not sure. I'm I'm saying that it's the Austerschmeitzen. That type of idea, that since it's totally on that person, that takes away from that, so we use a different set of criteria, how we decide what we should look at.